Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be studying Daniel chapter 3, verses 24 to 30, and we're going to begin by reading the text. In verse 24, we read, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, 'Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?' They replied, 'Certainly, your majesty.' He said, 'Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods.'" In the previous verse, Daniel's 3 friends were thrown into the blazing furnace, and that raised the question whether their God would deliver them. Well, verse 24 continues the suspense by not telling us what happened, but only relating Nebuchadnezzar's response. And so we're left to wonder, what is Nebuchadnezzar seeing? Nebuchadnezzar, who had asked, "What God will be able to deliver you from my hand if I throw you in the furnace?" jumps to his feet in amazement. And he asks, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And his advisors say, "Yeah, 3 men." Then Nebuchadnezzar says, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods." There's a lot of speculation about who this fourth figure is. This fourth figure has a human form, but is clearly not an ordinary human being. I say that because he appears suddenly. He is walking around in the fire. He seems to be the agent of salvation for the 3 Jews, and then he suddenly disappears at the end. Now, Nebuchadnezzar later refers to this figure as an angel sent by the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to rescue his servants. He says that in verse 28. Now, he says, in fact, that this figure looks like a son of the gods. Now, that Aramaic expression, Bar Elohim, means son of the gods. Now, it's important to notice that the first word, bar, is indefinite. So that means a son, not the son. And we also have to note that the second word in the phrase is plural. So a son of the gods, not the son of a god. Also, that Aramaic expression, that first word bar, is like the Hebrew word ben, which means son. But it can refer to a member of a group. For example, in the phrase, the sons of the prophets, sons there means a member of the group of the prophets. Now, there's some speculation that this figure could be the pre-incarnate Jesus, so Jesus before he took on human form in the flesh at his incarnation. But what would argue against that is the fact that the phrase is not "he looks like the Son of God," but the phrase is "he looks like a son of the gods." Additionally, Nebuchadnezzar, being a polytheistic pagan king, is not likely to have been referring to this fourth figure as a Jewish Messiah who was the Son of God. I think he'd have to be a Jew, first of all. And secondly, this concept of the Son of God as a Messiah is something that would have been developed over the course of Revelation and Jewish history. The thing that Nebuchadnezzar in fact does say is that this figure is an angel. He says that in verse 28. Now, referring to the fourth figure as an angel would simply mean that he was a messenger or a legitimate representative or agent of a deity. Now, in Mesopotamia, the messenger of the gods were also divine, although they were of a lower rank. One other way of reading the expression, "looks like a son of the gods," is to understand it as a reference to a divine being. The son of the gods meant a member of the class of the gods, and so a divine being, a spiritual being, a being from the heavenly realm. In fact, in Jewish tradition, in the Babylonian Talmud, the fourth figure has been referred to as the angel Gabriel. Note that angels appear in the Old Testament in human form when they appear to humans, and so without wings. The wings is perhaps a traditional way of depicting angels, which is not really accurate. I think that is a misunderstanding that's kind of come down in religious iconography, etc. The other way that the fourth figure has been regarded is as the angel of Yahweh. Now, the angel of Yahweh is a mysterious figure, appearing a number of times in the Old Testament. For example, in Genesis 18, with Abraham and these three visitors, one of whom speaks to Abraham as the Lord himself and is really the angel of Yahweh. Or in Judges, the angel of Yahweh appears to Samson's parents and also to Gideon. Or in the book of Exodus, the angel of Yahweh appears to Moses in the burning bush. Or in the book of Joshua, he appears to Joshua as a commander of the Lord's armies. This angel of Yahweh can represent the personal presence of God. It's as if God is personally there. As such, if this is the angel of Yahweh here in Daniel 3, this would be a theophany, a physical manifestation of the presence of God. Now, when God appears, for example, in the burning bush, he appears in the form of this angel. The angel of Yahweh is also identified as God. For example, in Genesis 16, verses 7 to 13, Genesis 18:2, 18:10, 18:13. Those are the passages with Abraham that I mentioned earlier. And also in Genesis 22:10 to 18, Exodus 3, 2 to 6. And there are other passages which we could mention. In Genesis 31:11, the angel of Yahweh calls himself God, as he does in Genesis 31:13 and Exodus 3:6. And he receives worship as God, for example, in Joshua 5:14 and Judges 2:1 to 5. Ultimately, this fourth figure represents an agent or messenger of God sent to rescue Daniel's three friends. And so the king Nebuchadnezzar considers the fourth individual to be a member of the class of deity who has been dispatched as an agent of a deity to effect a rescue operation. And so in this sense, God can be said to enter into the fire with these three Hebrew youngsters in order to save them. In the fourth man in the fire, in Daniel 3, we have a physical demonstration of God's presence with believers in their distress. This is in fact a graphic fulfillment of God's promise in Isaiah 43, verses 1 to 2. Let's read that. But now, this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob. He formed you, Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. In Isaiah 43, God promises his presence to be with his people to bring them through the period of the exile, in order to ensure that their trials and difficulties would not ultimately completely overwhelm them. And God fulfills this promise in Daniel 3 by entering into the fire with Daniel's three friends and delivering them. You know, it is in the fire that we meet God and understand who he is. If you think back through some of the difficult experiences maybe that you've had to walk through in this life, maybe God didn't spare you from those difficulties, But as you walked through them, you encountered and experienced God. You understood his faithfulness and his ability to carry you through those difficulties, and his care and love for you. And you came to know him in an experiential way. And perhaps because of that experience, as you see others going through difficulties, you can, as I tend to say to others, I know that God will walk with you. And I say that because I've had the experience of, in my own difficulties, God showing up and walking with me. I know that experientially. And in the same way, it is in the fire of our difficulties that we get to meet God and to understand who he is. As John Goldingay puts it, he says, God's promise, I will be with you, characteristically belongs to contexts of affliction and pressure. And he gives a number of examples. He says the experience of God's being with his people not only follows on their commitment to him rather than preceding it, it comes only in the furnace, not in being preserved from it. Goldingay said that we come to experience God's presence with us by being committed to him. And after we remain faithful to him, after we choose not to compromise, then we have the experience of him not delivering us from our challenge, but showing up in those challenges where we come to know him as a God who can and will save us. Well, in Daniel 3, verse 26, we continue reading. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. So having seen the three Jews walking around in the fire unbound and unharmed with the fourth man, Nebuchadnezzar approaches the opening of the blazing furnace and shouts to them to come out. Notice he can only approach the furnace and he's unable to go in. And he has to shout, perhaps because the heat of the fire kept him at some distance away. He is unable to compel them to come out, and he's got to ask them to do so. All of this, I think, demonstrates the power of their God and their God's ability to deliver them from Nebuchadnezzar's hand, despite their being thrown into the fiery furnace. The three Hebrews come out, and all the officials crowd around them and inspect them, verifying the miracle that has taken place. And they see that the fire has not harmed their bodies, not a hair on their heads was singed, their clothes were not scorched, and not even the smell of fire was upon them. You see, God has demonstrated that he could completely and perfectly deliver them from Nebuchadnezzar's hand, even if they were thrown into the fiery furnace, and that he could perfectly and completely deliver them from any harm. And so Nebuchadnezzar begins to acknowledge their God's power by referring to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as servants of the Most High God. And we read in verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The miracle of the salvation of these three Jews having been verified, Nebuchadnezzar praises their God. He had taunted them by asking what God would be able to save them from his hand if he threw them into the fiery furnace. And now he praises that God. And he's forced to acknowledge that their God was able to rescue them, and that their God had done so by sending his angel. Notice that the three friends are not rescued from the fire, but rescued in the fire. God demonstrates his power and sovereignty, not by sparing us from the difficulties, but by delivering us in our challenges. And so Nebuchadnezzar, this powerful king of Babylon, is forced to eat his words when he asks, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And he's forced to admit that he's wrong. More than this, however, the king is impressed by the relationship that these three Hebrews have with their powerful God. Nebuchadnezzar takes note of their faith. He says they trusted in their God. He takes note of their courage, the fact that they defied the king's command. And he takes note of their loyalty. They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. And so, although the king was angered by their decision, in the end, he respected their commitment. Non-Christians may not understand or appreciate Christian convictions, but they usually will respect those who are willing to take a stand for their God. Whereas before, Nebuchadnezzar had ordered all peoples of all nations and languages to bow down before the image he had set up, he now orders that anyone who says anything against the God of the Jews is to be killed and their property destroyed. Why? He says because no other God can save in this way. But I think that his decree may have been an attempt to appease the God of the Hebrews, who had been shown to be a very powerful God. And this God, I think Nebuchadnezzar was afraid would retaliate against him because he had mistreated that God's servants and challenged his power. Well, in the end, Nebuchadnezzar promotes the three Jews. The literal expression is the king caused them to prosper. And we see here at the end of this court tale of conflict, these three Jews are vindicated because they remained fervent and committed in their devotion and their loyalty to their God, and they refused to compromise. Well, one of the questions we have to ask is, what was God doing by performing this miracle? You see, God doesn't perform miracles in the Bible just to show off that he can do it. Each miracle has a purpose. There is some cause that is worthy of God's intervention. Now, remember, we said at the start of studying Daniel 3 that this story is a battle between Babylon, its gods, and its king on the one hand, and the God of Israel and his kingdom on the other hand. Well, Stephen Miller writes in his commentary on Daniel that Babylon had defeated Judah in battle, and pagans commonly held that victory over another nation was proof that their God was greater than the deity of the conquered foe. Yahweh wanted to dispel any such notion. Through this miracle and others recorded in the book, Yahweh made it clear to Nebuchadnezzar, who blatantly challenged Yahweh's power by his actions in this incident, and to all the world, that Judah's defeat was not because their God did not exist or was anemic. And so what God is doing here is showing that he is sovereign. He's showing Nebuchadnezzar and all people that even though Nebuchadnezzar had defeated the Jews and brought some of them back to Babylon, that it wasn't because the Jewish God was weak or asleep or unable to save them, but because that God had put those people into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Ultimately, the story is a continuing reminder to God's people throughout time that God is sovereign and that he is powerful to save and that he's deserving of their undivided worship and their commitment. The writer of the New Testament book, Hebrews, uses the story of Daniel's three friends to inspire Christians in his day by reminding them of past heroes of the faith who quenched the fury of the flames. I think he's referring there to Daniel 3. And so as Stephen Miller writes, if Yahweh could deliver the Hebrews from the furnace, he can see saints of any age through their fiery trials. You see, God can deliver from present challenges or fiery furnaces, but in His sovereignty, He may choose to not deliver us from present challenges, and we may suffer. But whether we're spared or we suffer, God will rescue us one way or the other, because ultimately, He'll deliver us from death, in the end with the resurrection which Daniel 12 envisages. And so the message to us is to persevere in the face of our challenges and to not compromise, but to remain, like Daniel's three friends, faithful to God, come what may. In our next video, we'll begin our study of Daniel 4. I look forward to seeing you then.